Good to see you again.
Yes.
With
Likewise,
no, it was 2 days.
Always a pleasure to be associated with anything that CAST and Gateway House do.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Manjeet.
Hi, can you, oh. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yes.
But you can't see me.
Correct.
Hear you. We can't see
We
you.
can see you as well, Manjeet.
We can
You
see
can
you
see
now.
me?
We can see
Oh,
you now.
good.
Yes, we can see you.
Yeah, now
Okay,
we can.
terrific. Okay, good.
You have done.
Okay.
It's
the
a
right-
little bit slow.
We should start now.
Please bear with me. So, good evening and welcome to the Gateway House KAS webcast. My name is Manjeet Kripalani and today we will be talking about realignments in West Asia. What a fantastic change we have seen. 10 years ago, starting with the so-called Arab Spring and now with the Abraham Accords. Perhaps sanctions on Iran will also be lifted and then we will really have a new West Asia. 10 years ago, people were rebelling against autocracy, and now the autocrats have recast themselves as reformers. Low oil prices in early 2020 had a lot to do with this. But how new is this new West Asia? Are its leaders now more responsive to their people, or are they in a game of self-preservation? Is the world really looking for a changed region in the midst of so much political turmoil with China, the economy, the receding dominance of the West, technology, the pandemic? What will a new West Asia look like? What does it mean internationally? What does it mean for India, which is so dependent on its energy and remittances from its diaspora in West Asia? With us today to discuss this is a stellar panel. Ambassador Navdeep Puri, an Arabist who has represented India's interest in the region so well, Dr. Joseph Keshian, an expert commentator on Arab affairs from the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh, and Professor Ephraim Enbar, a trusted policy advisor to successive Israeli governments, who is from the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. My colleague Samir Patil, our National Security Fellow, will moderate the panel. The discussion will run for 45 minutes, after which there will be audience Q&A for 20 minutes, which Samir will lead. Ambassador Rajiv Bharti of Gateway House will give closing remarks. But before we go on to Samir, may I ask Peter Ramel, the resident representative of KAS in India, to set the tone.
Thank you. Ambassador Navdeep Suri, Dr. Joseph Albert Kechichian, Professor Ibrahim Inbar, Ambassador Bhatia, Mr. Samir Patil, dear Manjeet, and friends, ladies and gentlemen. As always, it's a pleasure indeed to partner the Gateway House for yet another discussion on one of the most discussed regions of our times, which is infused with fast-paced dynamics and remains, let's say, volatile to say the least. As we look back upon the early month of the past year, the overall security picture of West Asia, that is from an Indian perspective, if we look from the perspective of the US or Europe, it would be the Middle East. It appeared rather bleak, maybe black too. The civil wars in Yemen and Syria continued to shatter lives and destroy livelihoods. Simultaneously, the heated political rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran and the isolation of Qatar, as also the competition between Saudi Arabia and Turkey for the leadership of the Islamic world, set the stage for a scenario that evoked vivid memories of the Cold War in many of us. On yet another front, the recurring skirmishes between the US under the Trump administration and Iran risked spiraling out of control when a sequence of escalating events culminated in the assassination of the Iranian General Soleimani, and even now, as I speak, there is a staring match going on between the two countries over the re-entry of the US in the JCPOA Accord. And let us see who blinks first, pardon the pun. And to add to this cauldron was the US recognition of Jerusalem as capital of Israel, which did not help matters much. As a result of these events, crucial issues concerned the geopolitical challenges, regional security, and energy security have once again resurfaced in a region tormented by severe turmoil for the past half decade. Yet, besides these challenges, we should all not forget or underestimate the fact that recently more and more rays of hope have been shining on the overall picture of West Asia. The realignment of some West Asian countries through the historic Abraham Accords and the Al-Ula Agreement are like a breath of fresh air and represent the first of many diplomatic building blocks needed for the goal of achieving a sustainable peace in this historically volatile region. However, in light of the manifold geopolitical challenges in the region, we cannot rest on our laurels, and we must continue to strive for a tangible reconciliation intended to finally draw the Arab-Israeli conflict to its end. The realignment of policies between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel ought to be widened to encompass other member states of the Arab League, with the aim of shaping a new era of peace across the region. As all our nations face diverse and complex global changes, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is a good example for possible cooperation, we can overcome them only through high levels of intergovernmental collaboration, cooperation in the fields of intelligence, security, while forging of firmer economic partnerships. Amongst all this clash of interests from geopolitics and geoeconomic perspectives, the world is looking at the US Red Biden administration to reassume a balanced leadership position in the post-pandemic situation, where the world is really at inflection point with the already emerged China trying using military aggression, Wolf warrior diplomacy, and stealthy economic mercantilism as some of the tools. As Manjit has already mentioned it before, from an Indian perspective, we have to look at the region mainly from the energy security perspective that might decrease or will decrease with time and with diversification, but for the time being, it is still a real seriously to be taken concern. And as a desired side effect of this development, it may also mean that renewable energies would constitute an essential contribution towards reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement. Let me conclude. Let us all derive inspiration and purpose from the latest push for peaceful coexistence in West Asia, epitomized by the Abraham Accords. Hereby, the LAC Treaty, and as a representative of CAS, I have to recall that it can serve as a striking testimony to the diplomatic efforts of Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle to remind us that enduring peace and close friendship, and I would state that is there between France and Germany, it is possible between once feuding states and their citizens. That's an important element too. It's indeed possible and ought to be a common goal for all of our nations. Establishing such close cooperation in the fight for a secure West Asia, and indeed the world as a whole, will help us in building broader trust, regardless of past differences. That is why we at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation advocate and continue to advocate for unity, multilateral cooperation, and perseverance. These principles provide us with a compass as we steer our way through these global challenges to emerge stronger, more united, and resilient than ever. And now I'm delighted and honored to yield the floor to Manjit while being sure of the rich feast of ideas and visions that is bound to emerge from our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Samir, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Manjit, and thank you, Peter, for setting the scene so well. I just wanted to tell you that Dr. Joseph Kishishian is unable to join us because he is facing severe thunderstorm in his city, and therefore there has been outage of power as well as internet. So he has expressed his regrets and not joining us. So before I open the discussion, I just want to explain the house rules. As Manjit mentioned, the discussion will run for 45 minutes, after which there will be the audience Q&A for 20 minutes. Please put your questions in the chat box and also do mention for which of the two panelists the question is addressed. So without any delay, let us start the discussion. My first question to you is Professor Inbar. West Asia has seen momentous changes in recent months, starting with the Abraham Accords. How do you see the regional dynamics in the near future from Jerusalem?
First of all, I want to mention that Jerusalem is under snow, which is not very usual, and it looks divine. I'm sure some people will share this view with me about the Abraham Accords. Obviously, those were historic accords, and they were a result of, in my view, of three historic trends. The first one is growing acceptance of Israel within the Arab world. After all, Israel was established in 1948, and it's already 70 years afterwards. Many Arabs were born to a situation where Israel was a fait accompli, and they decided to engage with Israel in different ways. Of course, the pioneers were Egypt in 1979 already having a peace treaty with us, afterwards Jordan in 1994, and even the Palestinians with Oslo Accords, which were not a great success, but still brought some kind of interactions between the Palestinian national movement and the Zionist, the Jewish national movement in the land of Israel. So this is the first historic trend. The second one is was started already by the Americans. Already Obama decided to leave the Middle East. Trump continued actually this trend. We've seen a withdrawal of the Americans from the Middle East. What was most significant is the lack of American reaction to the destruction of oil fields in Saudi Arabia by Iran. And it is clear that the Biden administration probably will go along with this line because they need, first of all, less the Middle East in terms of energy. They have their own sources. And there is a wariness. Americans were engaged in wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, those experiences were not very successful, and they want to get out. This is an understandable feeling in the United States. The president, act upon those popular feelings. A third trend, and parallel to what has been happening, is a growing threat of Iran in the region. Iran, particularly through its proxies, is very active, as you know, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and is trying to attain hegemony in this area. After all, Iran inherits a Persian imperial tradition, and they have this in mind. Beyond that, of course, is a nuclear factor. Their nuclear ambitions are a threat to all their neighbors, and particularly the countries in the Gulf, like United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia, which was also behind the Abraham Accords. So those are the three main trends. And if we take a look through realpolitik lens, and those are the lens of the leadership of all countries in West Asia, it's only Israel that can stop Iran. Israel has a military capability, and it demonstrated its political will to put an end to hostile nuclear programs in the past. So this is a clear result of those trends. Apart from that, I would like to point out that the Abraham Accords in contrast to the Egyptian and the Jordanian peace treaties with Israel, also lend legitimacy to the state of Israel. By using the word Abrahamic, they lend religious legitimacy to the Jewish people. We all belong to the same Abrahamic religious tradition. And this is, of course, a further step advancing understanding between Israelis and Arabs in this area. Furthermore, the Abrahamic accords clearly undermine a widespread notion in the Arab world that Israel is a creation of colonialist powers. No, we are natives. We belong to this region since the times of Abraham. So this is indeed a very powerful message that is communicated to the Arabs in the region. And indeed, we've seen Sudan and Morocco joining this trend as a result of the American diplomacy, which of course contributed to this great achievement.
Thank you.
I think that it will continue for a while.
Right. Thank you, Professor Inbar. And in fact, I'm going to come back to some of those themes which you mentioned in your answer. But before that, I go to Ambassador Suri. Ambassador Suri, Prime Minister Modi's Link West policy has seen India's relations with the Arab world and Israel flourish. Where do we go from here? What is the next step for India?
Well, you're right that the Prime Minister's made a very strong personal commitment in terms of our relationship with the Gulf in particular. Sometimes it needs to be placed in perspective that when he went to Abu Dhabi in August of 2015, that was the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister in 34 years. The last one before that was Mrs. Gandhi in 1981. And since then, during my term as ambassador, he visited twice more. And in each of these visits, and we had Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed from UAE as the chief guest on our Republic Day. So you can see that the intensity of the exchange that has taken place. Along with that, the Saudi Arabia as well has been a country where we've placed special attention. And I think the kind of strategic partnership that has emerged with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia over the last 5 years or so has been very rewarding for us in political terms and in economic and energy terms. If you look at the political side of it, without wanting to bring up the India-Pakistan hyphenation, but I think it's important to remember that till a few years back, Pakistan really used to treat the Gulf as its backyard and as part of the extended Ummah, where it could count on unquestioned support. That has changed dramatically, and today it finds itself in this embarrassing position that even on something like Jammu and Kashmir, it finds it difficult to draw support from its erstwhile allies. Beyond that, Dubai, for example, used to be the playground for terrorist groups like Dawood Ibrahim's outfit. And today the Emiratis have zero hesitation in picking up and deporting people who or sending back or extraditing people, depending on their nationality, who have been a security threat to India. So that's the kind of political and security transformation that we have seen. When you say, where do we go from here? I think, we've made beginning in the energy sector, which is very important. Worth remembering that, India used to scout for energy assets from Venezuela all the way to Vladivostok. But we never got a toehold in our own backyard in the Gulf. And we got our first oil concessions in UAE in 2017. And thereafter, we've developed our first strategic petroleum reserve in Mangalore with the collaboration of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. And the Saudis and the Emiratis are still ready to put up this mega greenfield refinery in Maharashtra once we get the politics of it sorted out in our own backyard. So there's a lot happening there. I think that the area where we have done work, but where we need to do more work is encouraging the sovereign funds from these countries to be more active, more aggressive in terms of investing in India. We've seen Abu Dhabi Investment Authority become the first anchor investor into India's National Infrastructure Investment Fund, make major commitments into highways, into renewable energy, into airports, and so on. But I think despite all the progress that has been made, a lot of wrinkles remain that need to be ironed out in terms of our own investment regulations to be able to give more comfort to institutional investors who bring the kind of patient long-term capital that the Indian economy really needs. But I do want to take half a minute also to respond to Professor Inbar's, just to add a couple of points on the Abraham Accords. You know, while it's one thing to, you know, and he's articulated the Israeli perspective on the Abraham Accords, I think it's important to look at where the Emiratis were coming on this. Because from their perspective, despite all the hue and cry that they sold out the Palestinians, they say that, hang on, you know, everybody talks about the normalization of relationship, but the other part of the accord was that Prime Minister Netanyahu agreed to freeze or suspend the proposed annexation of certain controversial areas in the West Bank. And I think we need to remember that there was that second part of the Abraham Accord. I think beyond that, 2 points strike me in particular. One is that unlike the peace between Egypt and Israel, which, you know, Camp David is now, what, 4 decades old, has been a bit of a cold peace. Whereas the speed at which normalization has taken place between Israel and UAE really has caught everybody by surprise. There's a delegation a week, there's officials, there's ministers, there's technology guys, finance guys, entrepreneurs, and the speed at which announcements are coming, their direct flights. I think UAE is the only country with which Israel has announced a visa-free travel arrangement. So, you know, just that momentum has caught a lot of people by surprise. And what the Emiratis are trying to say is, you know, the point that Professor Inbar made about acceptance of Judaism, you know, they are cleaning up the textbooks to remove anti-Semitism. There is now a rabbi in Dubai. You can get kosher food in a restaurant. So you know, the number of things that are being done visibly by a leadership to tell its people that you may have a political problem with Israel, but there isn't a problem with Judaism per se. And I think that's a huge shift being undertaken before our eyes.
Thank you, Ambassador Suri. In fact, I'm going to talk about the Abraham Accords and the legacy of the Trump administration. Professor Inbar, you know, now that the Biden administration has taken over in the White House, do you see American policy with regard to the region as well as probably on Iran changing? And what is the view within the government and outside the government, especially on this issue?
First of all, Biden administration has a very full plate. It has to deal with domestic issues, particularly the corona and the economic crisis. And of course, it has foreign policy issues preceding Iran, of course, relations with China and Russia. Having said that, there is a clear change on the issue of Iran. The Biden administration has announced that it wants to return to negotiations with Iran over an improved JCPOA of 2015. We in Israel have always made the point that this agreement is full of holes and is not a good one. And it seems that the Biden administration has adopted, at least initially, some of the criticism which was voiced by Israel, and not only by Israel, also France and other countries. So, but there is a change definitely in tone vis-a-vis Iran. We don't know how Iran will respond. We have to remember that Iran plays a very tough game, and in June they have elections for a new president, and all approved candidates are of the hawkish streak. So we don't know if the Biden initiative to bring back Iran to the negotiating table will be successful. In any case, in Israel, we definitely fear that the Biden administration will eventually go back to the agreement without major changes, and this will force us to think twice what to do about this issue. Iranians are getting closer to the bomb, and this is something that Israel cannot live with. There is another issue which concerning the Middle East. This is a Palestinian issue. It's quite clear that the Biden administration doesn't put the Palestinian issue high on its agenda, and it will not probably even make the efforts that the Trump administration made to bring the Palestinians to the negotiating table. And again, it seems that they have adopted a more realistic position, again, proposed by Israel, that since it's impossible or very unlikely to have a real agreement between the Palestinians as in their stage at this time and Israel, so the proposed strategy should be conflict resolution, basically to try to cause less bleeding to both people as much as possible, to try to improve the lives of the Palestinians, economic lives, as much as possible and as much as the Palestinian bureaucracy can do. It's a very corrupt structure, political structure, and it has its own difficulties. Generally, Israel still commands considerable bipartisan support in the United States. It has a lot of influence, and Biden announced that he will keep the embassy in Jerusalem, which I think will bring about an additional dose of reality, of realism to the region. Israel is not going to give up on Jerusalem, that's quite clear. And if the Palestinians are interested in having peace with Israel, they should abandon this dream. There is no reason for the Palestinians to demand a capital in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, the majority of the people are Jews for the past 150 years. There was never an Arab capital in Jerusalem. And if we make a referendum and ask the Arab residents of Jerusalem if they want to be under Arafat or Abu Mazen, their answer is clearly no. And they're not that stupid to try to live under the Palestinian authorities. Life in Israel is much better. Generally, of course, there is a fear in Jerusalem that Biden, although it's not Obama #2 administration, not at all, will signal weakness, particularly in West Asia. We've seen already one example when they decided to limit or to end their support for Saudi war in Yemen against the Shiite Houthis, which is a proxy of Iran, not to see them as a terrorist organization. This obviously will not create a positive response towards the United States. We've seen the Houthis continuing to attack Saudi Arabia. And but this remains to be seen if Biden and Blinken will learn the hard lessons of West Asia.
Thank you. Ambassador Puri, I'm going to seek your comment on this. How do you see Biden administration's West Asia policy, and particularly in Saudi Arabia, because repeatedly American officials have spoken about recalibrating the US relationship with Riyadh?
We all know what kind of regime is in Saudi Arabia. And sometimes you have to make difficult choices in foreign policy between emphasis on human rights and stability. And I think that the United States undermines the regime of Mubarak in Egypt, which was a bad call. And I hope they'll not do the same in Saudi Arabia, particularly at this time when there is a person that has the power and seems to be interested in making certain reforms in Saudi Arabia, which may lead to a more benign, dictatorship. We have to be realistic. What in this area, in the area we are living in, we don't see too many democracies. Turkey was a democracy, quasi-democracy, and now it's descending into an authoritarian regime. And so you should try to do things that are realistic and not to make choices that will bring about a worse situation. Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Iraq today, what is better? I'm not a big fan of Saddam Hussein, but we don't want Iraq, which has a civil war, and the Iranians are influencing it. So, this idealistic view coming sometimes from liberals in Washington and in Europe is counterproductive.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Suri.
Samir, let me say it's fair to say that the Gulf countries, and in particular UAE and Saudi Arabia, were fairly heavily invested in the Trump administration. For all the sins of the Trump administration, if you see that two foreign policy successes, and perhaps the only two foreign policy successes, were the Abraham Accords and the Al-Ula Accord, which brought about some degree of normalization with Qatar and a bit of an end to that 4-year-long feud. Having said that, when I would in Abu Dhabi or in other Gulf countries, when I would speak with my interlocutors, what caught me by surprise was the visceral dislike for the Obama administration. And it was something that I wasn't prepared for when I used to hear from them. And the reason was JCPOA, and not just the points that Professor Inbars mentioned. From a Gulf perspective, the JCPOA was flawed, not that it wasn't hard enough on the nuclear issue, but it ignored two other problems that the Gulfis have with Iran. One is its interference in Arab affairs. And from an Arab perception, the effort to create a kind of a Shia crescent from these eastern oil fields of Saudi Arabia into Yemen, or from Yemen into Saudi Arabia, into Bahrain, into Iraq, into Syria, and then into Lebanon. And this kind of encirclement that they saw from an aggressive Iranian dispensation was deeply unsettling. And they said, how can you try and normalize relations on the nuclear issue, but not talk about the regional security issues and not involve us who are sitting right there and actually have the 5+1 formula where no country from the region itself is involved in the conversation. So there are a fundamental problem that they had with the way the Obama administration went ahead with the JCPOA. And the second one was that, you're not talking about the delivery capabilities that Iran has developed, the whole missile capacity that it has evolved over the years. So I think the Biden administration, to the extent that it holds senior officials from the former Obama administration, is going to be seen with a degree of caution. I think people are already trying to establish the relationships with the new administration, and they are going to find it challenging initially. Certainly, the over-the-top warmth or energy that Trump and Kushner and company put into a couple of areas that were of interest to them may not get replicated in quite the same way. So I think that you will see that the Gulf countries have to realign themselves to adjust to the new reality, even as they try to lobby Washington for protecting their concerns.
And what about UAE? From your own time in Abu Dhabi, please tell us what are the considerations for Abu Dhabi as such when it looks at the region and it assesses its position.
You know, and I shouldn't be accused of localitis when I say this, because diplomats are fairly prone to developing this curious ailment. But UAE is quite an interesting country because it really punches way above its weight in the neighborhood. Partly it's because of the wealth and resources. Partly it's because of the ambition and vision, and to an extent competence of its leaders. After Israel, they have probably the most capable army in the Middle East, perhaps more even than Egypt, in terms of the assets that they have and the training and logistics capabilities that they have. You see them willing to deploy that capacity in terms of operations as far afield as Libya. You have, alongside that military capacity and ambition that they have shown, is also an effort to redefine the region, and particularly to redefine the role of religion in the region. I can narrate a first-hand conversation that I had with one of the top leaders who in UAE, who was trying to argue. When this was a conversation that we had when we were pitching for certain facilities for a major Hindu temple in Abu Dhabi, and he started talking about the fact that UAE soldiers were involved in Afghanistan post 9/11, so he said they were quite shocked when Sheikh Zayed, the late Sheikh Zayed, decided to join the coalition troops in Afghanistan, and said, "Hey, do you think that our soldiers are going to be killing other Muslims in Afghanistan?" And so Sheikh Zayed said, "Do you think that what Osama bin Laden did was an Islamic act? And if it is, then fine. But if you think it was un-Islamic to attack innocent civilians in that fashion, then you have an obligation to go and fight." So I'm saying this because, in a sense, the Emiratis have talked themselves into saying that we are the front line against religious fundamentalism and extremism. And so not only are they taking a very hard line against Muslim Brotherhood, for example, and they've declared them a terrorist organization. And they've said that political Islam per se is the beginning of the slippery slope towards radicalization. But going a step beyond, they've created this high-profile Ministry of Tolerance with a very eminent member of the royal family who heads it, and they do these really interesting things of bringing Pope Francis and the Grand Sheikh of Al-Azhar together into Abu Dhabi, announcing that they are setting up this House of Abraham's family, where you'll have a mosque, a synagogue, and a church in the same complex, etc., etc. So I think, from a neutral perspective, UAE is an interesting country to watch for the way it is trying to reorder the region. And in this, the very close personal relationship between Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi and Sheikh Mohammed bin Salman in Riyadh is a factor that is present all the time, and you don't often see it.
And of course, not to forget that UAE also hosts the Sawab Center, which gives out a counter propaganda to religious radicalization. Thank you.
And the Al Hidayah Center, and the Al Hidayah Center for Countering Violent Extremism.
Correct. That's also correct. Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Enver, I'm going to ask you a difficult question. And it is about the International Criminal Court, which on February 5 ruled that it would have jurisdiction to investigate the potential war crimes committed in the Palestinian territories. What are the options for Israel in these circumstances, given that Israel is not a member of the International Criminal Court?
The Palestinian appeal to ICC, as well to other international organizations, is part of their strategy to not to bring themselves to negotiate with Israel. Their strategy has been for years to try to create some kind of international, whatever that means, consensus, or the consensus of the international community, to force Israel to do things that they are not ready to do instead of direct negotiations. And of course, many of those international organizations, from an Israeli perspective, and they should, I think, should be a wider perspective, are morally bankrupt. You know, the Human Rights Organization doesn't go after China, doesn't go after Zimbabwe, doesn't go after countries that are clearly non-democratic, and I use here a British understatement, and they go after Israel. This is, you know, we are used to this unique treatment, and therefore, basically, we don't pay much attention to those international organizations, and particularly since our military behavior is impeccable. You know, I've been a combat soldier. I've been in the paratroopers, and I've seen a lot of, you know, my comrades fall, and I participated in many military actions. When I mentioned before in the pre-conference discussions that I was in Lebanon without a passport, this was one of the occasions that I was, and there was several times, almost half a year. And I think that the Israeli army is probably the most moral army in the world. I don't know if you're aware. At the division level, there is a lawyer that has to approve every military action. Every target has to be pre-approved. Of course, in the height of combat, things you don't go call your lawyer, you know, can I respond to fire from this house or this house? You have a certain freedom of action, but in the Air Force doesn't attack any structure that has not received legal clearance. So, and of course, if there are cases, unfortunately, that are undisciplined soldiers, they don't behave as they should do, and of course, we take them to court. And we have a notion of purity of arms. We have to keep our arms pure, not because of the international community. We don't care so much about the international community. The Jews have been an object of hatred and pogroms and many things, so we are not that sensitive to the international community. But I want to look in the mirror and to be sure that I behaved properly. And of course, there are situations that it's not always easy to make a decision. There are split-second decisions. Those are very difficult decisions. I don't know how many of you and in the audience have participated in military action. It puts a lot of stress, moral stress, on every person. And I think generally the Israeli army, you know, with exceptions, we are just human beings, has behaved admirably in the battlefield. Therefore, ICC is, a fly on the, it doesn't bother us. And of course, we'll take action, whatever is needed. Americans are also not part of it. There are other countries that are not part of the ICC, and those institutions are extremely biased against Israel. And we live with it for so many years. We'll continue to live with a chorus that's saying you are the bad guys. It's important if we can look in the mirror. That's what is important for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Inbar, for your observations. Ambassador, my last question to you before I open the floor for Q&A from the audience. You, Professor Inba talked about Egypt. Now, Egypt used to be central to the Arab world, but now, how is it coping with these changes? Because it is where the Arab Spring started, and now 10 years later, where we are. How is Egypt is coping with these kind of changes within and without?
I think it's not an easy change to swallow. I remember from my first posting in Egypt back in the 80s, early 80s, and there was this prominent Egyptian intellectual, Muhammad Hasnain Haikal, who was one of the great strategic thinkers of the region at that time. And he kind of captured the sentiment in Egypt towards the nouveau riche in the Gulf, who had recently acquired the oil wealth. And he's called it famously the camel to Cadillac syndrome, saying that in one generation, these people have moved from a camel to a Cadillac, and what do you expect from them? But today, if you look at India's relationship with, say, UAE, compared to Egypt, our trade is 10 times with UAE as compared to Egypt. The breadth of our relationship is much greater. The depth of our relationship is much greater. And the reason is that Egypt somehow hasn't been able to get its act together. Today, I think that they are in a state where post the failed Arab Spring, the government in place is even more harsh and even more repressive than the Mubarak government. I hear from many of my young Egyptian friends that they are voting with their feet. And you're seeing a real flight of talent because of both lack of economic opportunity and because of the degree of political repression, for whatever better word, or lack of political space, if you want to put it that way. And so combined with the lack of resources, the lack of the very inefficient bureaucracy, I think Egypt has found itself gradually slipping. And today you have Emiratis, for example, and the Saudis calling the shots on certain aspects of foreign policy. The boycott of Qatar was a case in point where the decision is taken somewhere else, but Cairo has to implement it. I think, until you start seeing a strong economic and political revival of Egypt, it will continue to lose momentum in the region, and it is no longer playing the leadership role that it used to play at the time of Nasser, at the time of Sadat, even to an extent during the time of Mubarak.
Okay, thank you. I have so many questions, but I think let's open the floor for the audience Q&A. And there are many questions in the chat box already. One question is to Mr. Suri. So this question is from Vice Admiral Chauhan. So you think, looking at India's West Asia options, this is an opportune moment for New Delhi to actually expand the membership of the IORA to include Saudi Arabia in particular, but also Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq?
Well, UAE is chairing IORA as of last year, if I'm not mistaken. So some countries are already in an active membership role, and hopefully others will join in as well. So yeah, I think it certainly makes sense for us, because we see the Gulf as part of our maritime security zone. And I think there's a recognition in some of the Gulf countries that India, which is large, stable, and increasingly more capable in the naval domain, is a net contributor to maritime security and stability in that region. We have an arrangement with Oman today for use of their facilities in Duqm. We have done naval exercises with the Emiratis, which were very useful. And, last year, a year and a half back, when you had that real crisis in the Gulf and things were looking quite rough, the fact that we deployed 2 of our naval vessels to escort in shipping in the Gulf was taken as a very positive thing, that India is not a free rider in the security domain, but one that is willing to bear some of the weight. And we did that independently without coming under the US umbrella. So I think that, from all of those aspects, there is certainly a case for a much greater level of maritime engagement, whether it's in the context of EORA or otherwise. There could be other platforms as well.
Okay, thank you. My next 2 questions are actually to Professor Inbar, both related to Abraham Accords. One is, what led to this sudden restoration of peace between Qatar and other countries in West Asia, as well as with Israel? And the second question is, from Peter. Does this also then mean that the status of the para organizations in the region, such as Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood, that will decline?
Well, first of all, about Qatar, I think Qatar was returned to the lap of the Gulf states because it didn't work. The siege on Qatar didn't work, and it was clearly a failure of policy, and you had to do something about it. And to some extent, the Trump administration did them a favor, pushing for it, and they agreed. I don't think that the basic dispute between Qatar and the rest of the Gulf is, particularly on the issue of political Islam, are over. Al Jazeera will continue to be an issue for many Arab politicians. And the mere fact that Qatar funds so many Muslim Brother activities in the region and its alignment with Turkey is continuing to be a problem. But for the time being, they kiss each other, and it's less of a public problem, but the dispute has not ended. So we'll see how it develops. By the way, Qatar always had some kind of relations with Israel during Oslo Accords, and afterwards. Now they bribe the Hamas people not to send missiles into Israel. They get the money, and they just send them some COVID, vaccines. The Sputnik, the Russian made, and Qatar will continue to have a different policy because of their leadership that has its own ambitions. Remind me, the second question was?
The second question is about the status of these organizations such as Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood.
Okay.
Will this restoration?
Before that, I want to reinforce the observation made by Ambassador Sori that the Abraham Accords are qualitatively different than the peace accords that we had with Egypt and Jordan. We see one peace. My institute has excellent relation with the Emirati Institute. I never was able to establish a close dialogue with the Egyptian Institute. I remember one day I ran for a time, many years, the Begin Sadat Center at Bar-Ilan University. And when I was in Egypt, I made my business to go to Egypt once in a while because I wanted to see with my own eyes what's happening there. And I once mentioned, okay, I hope that one day in Egypt, you'll have also an institute named after an Egyptian leader and an Israeli leader. And there was dead quiet in the audience. Nobody appreciated my remark. And in contrast, of course, the Emiratis are very different. It's incredible what's going on between Israel and the Emiratis. And this is despite the COVID pandemic, which puts a brake on many interactions. So this is indeed quite a development. In Israel, we are extremely pleased with this development. And of course, we thank President Trump and Jared Kushner for their efforts, which brought about this important development. Israel was probably one of the most pro-Trump countries, more than America. If you would have run for elections in Israel, he probably would have been elected for a variety of reasons. We are basically a more conservative country than the United States. About Hamas and Hezbollah, they are offshoots of Iran. Hezbollah is clearly a proxy with little freedom of action. It doesn't make its own decisions. It gets its money partly from Iran, partly from smuggling, all good stuff towards the world, to Latin America and other places, be it arms, be it drugs. Hamas is somewhat different. Hamas has some kind of leverage, but it gets money from Iran, and also training. But Iran established a real proxy in Gaza. This is the Islamic Jihad, the Palestinian Jihad organization. And so this type of organization will continue to prosper and be there as long as we do not deal strongly with Iran. And again, I share the view that the JCPOA totally ignored the regional behavior of Iran. And nowadays we hear voices, interestingly, from France that says in the new agreement, we have to bring into the negotiations Israel and Saudi Arabia and maybe the United Arab Emirates, which makes sense, of course. I don't know if it makes sense in Tehran, but it should make sense in Europe and in the United States. So those, as long as Iran continues its mischief in West Asia, those organizations will continue to exist.
Okay, thank you, Professor Inba. Ambassador Suri, I'm going to return to the issue that you discussed during your initial comments about the energy. Now, what impact do you see of the oil sanctions on Iran in terms of India's own purchase from Iran? And also in terms of the potential Indian buying of the crude oil from Iran and its impact on the political relationship that we have with Saudi Arabia and the UAE?
Look, well, on the first part first, the US sanctions on Iran have a disruptive impact for us. We've tried to adapt, but several of our refineries were conditioned to take the Iranian crude as opposed to other kinds of crude, and we've had to make the adjustments for that. For us, obviously, having a diversity of sources, particularly in our own neighborhood, makes sense. And the fact that we lose out on a major market in our neighborhood is problematic. So the US sanctions are not something that makes us very happy. We've over the years tried to find ways to work with the Americans, and the carve out on Chabahar port, for example, was one example of an exception made by the Americans, so that a project that was seen important in the interest of both countries could continue. We'll be happy if the sanctions pressure on the Iranians is eased and we are able to pursue relatively normal trading relations with Iran. India has never been a fan of unilateral single country sanctions. We think that the multilateral UN Security Council approach towards sanction is a better one, and I think we will be guided by that approach. On on one side and Saudi and UAE on other, for us, it's not a question of either or. I think what we've demonstrated over the years in terms of our foreign policy is an ability to talk to each of the parties, even though they might be at war with each other. Take the case of Israel, since we have Professor Inbar here. And everybody speaks of Prime Minister Modi's historic visit to Israel, but conveniently forgets about his equally historic visit to Ramallah, which was which was an effort to maintain that kind of a balance. So I certainly don't see our relations with Saudi Arabia and UAE being at the expense of our relationship with Iran. The point that I think was made in earlier comments was that Iranians are not easy to do business with. And so even with the best of intent, there are always limitations on how far, how fast you can move. Whereas what you've seen with the Emiratis and the Saudis is once the intent is declared from their side, you can actually get a lot of things moving very rapidly. And so our relationships with the Saudis and the Emiratis have moved much faster and much further in the last few years, simply because of the way those societies are structured. And when you have a decision from the top that this is what needs to be done, it gets done.
Okay, thank you. One question that we ought to discuss actually is Turkey's expanded role in West Asia, and Professor Inbar actually made some comments on that. And in fact, he has also written about adopting a pragmatic Israeli strategy towards Turkey to distinguish between Erdogan's regime and the Turkish state as such. I want to get Ambassador Suri's comments on the role of Turkey, and also actually drawing on one of our participants is Huri Islamoglu. So she was a visiting scholar with Gateway House, and she's a Turkish scholar currently residing in Istanbul. So, Professor Ambassador Suri, and then I'm going to ask Huri to chip in.
So look, Turkey's slide in the direction that it has taken over the last few years is not a positive development for us, and it certainly complicates the relationships in the region. I think what you have seen is Erdogan try to assume the mantle of leadership in the Islamic world. He sensed an opportunity there, and so he has consciously moved not just his own party, which may have been so inclined, but he's also tried to drag a reluctant Turkish population along with him in that direction. And for us, unfortunately, it manifests in this strange situation that when we have the revocation of Article 370, Turkey is leading the charge against India. Whereas most of the Arab countries and most of the rest of the Muslim countries are quiet about it. And I think it was Turkey, it was Iran, and it was Malaysia, each for a particular reason that chose to voice some sympathy for Pakistan's stance. So, Turkey seeks to play that role of being the voice and leader of Islam. The Saudis are not going to give up their throne in a hurry. And so you've seen that pushback, including on OIC matters, including on the Kashmir issue itself, but also on a range of other issues. And one of the challenges that in the whole dynamics with Qatar was that to reduce its dependence on its neighbors, Qatar moved very close to Turkey very quickly, and to the extent of having Turkish troops based in Qatar, and that became again an important sticking point with the Saudis and the others. So I think Erdogan's been adventurous. But at the end of the day, if he can't get his economic house in order, and if the Turkish economy continues to face the headwinds that it has over the last 5 years, then the capacity to sustain that adventurism will get limited. And you're already seeing that because of that, Turkey is having to readjust its postures, whether it is towards Israel, whether it is towards the Europeans, whether it is towards the Americans. You can see some of that work in progress happening.
Thank you, Ambassador Suri. You can do you want to speak?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
No, I'm asking my friend Puri. Puri? Oh, I think she's in the participant, but she.
Hear me?
I think she's in.
I'm here.
Yes, please.
Can you
Please.
hear me?
You want to talk about? Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry?
We can hear you. I want to ask you about comments from both Professor Enbar and Ambassador Suri about Turkey's expanded role in West Asia.
Yes.
And how do you look at it from Istanbul?
Yes, I would like to respond to that with a larger case of developments in West Asia. I think an important legacy of Trump administration in the region may be that Arab-Israeli conflict will no longer dominate our vision of the region of West Asia. Even oil and gas policies may not dominate that discussion from now on. So yesterday, looking at the New York Times, I noticed something quite out of the ordinary. There was an article in the New York Times showering praise on Turkey's President Tayyip Erdogan and his policy of intervention in Syria. The article, penned by Carlota Gal, a staunch and a passionate critic of the president, told us that the Turkish army in northern Syria, in Afrin, provided millions of Syrians with refuge from brutalities of the Syrian government and its ally, the Russians. Further, Carlota Gal could not help but notice that the Turkish military presence also meant introduction of educational and health services to Syrians who flocked to the region, escaping Syrian regimes, armies. Similarly, positive signals were transmitted to Ankara from the new administration in Washington, notwithstanding some pattings on the wrist regarding human rights violations of Erdogan's regime. Something is afoot. Some things are definitely changing in West Asia, earlier signaled by the new set of alignments you have been talking about this morning, this afternoon, whatever, the Abraham Accord, etc. What I'm going to suggest here is that what we're witnessing is not just another rearrangement of state of affairs regarding flows of energy resources from West Asia by big powers, mainly Western and big corporations, and this is not happening behind closed doors, often using military power. Failure of the last of such attempts in Afghanistan and Iraq, more than anything else, mirrored the failure of a Western model of governance of the global economy from the top, with a priority of enabling and protecting Western corporations and their investments and trade. Following 2008 crisis in the developed Western economies and now COVID crisis, the governance of global economic order is increasingly shifting to regional powers. The new pattern of governance is one which will be crafted by confrontations, alliances, negotiations among regional powers, and big corporations, Western and Chinese, will have to be part of such struggles without claiming any privilege or superiority. So what I see is a new pattern of governance emerging in the region and not dictated by Western powers or outside powers. The new pattern of governance is more likely to speak to aspirations and expectations of regional actors, seeking market openings, employment opportunities provided by investment in infrastructure and industry. Of these regional actors, more aptly described as emerging economies in the region, I can see Turkey, Iran, and Russia, and of course, Israel. Israel's regionalization and normalization I see as part of this process, and which was long overdue. But I don't see this as an occasion for whitewashing Israel's, especially Israel's army's violations performed against Palestinians, injustices committed against Palestinians. These two issues should be kept separate. The regionalization of Israel, its normalization, should not be an occasion for whitewashing its violations vis-a-vis Palestinians. That aside, when we look at the regional actors, in particular Turkey.
Sorry, if I can interrupt you for a moment. Maybe you can just wrap up because we have two other questions to ask actually, and we are actually running out of time. So maybe you can just wrap up in the next 30 seconds.
I don't hear you well. Okay. Could you repeat the question?
Can you hear me properly? I'm saying,
So,
can you just please wrap up in the next 30 seconds because we have actually exceeded the time limit for the webinar. Huri?
yes.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, Huri. We just move on actually. And actually, my apologies. I didn't introduce Huri properly. So Huri actually is an economist, and she teaches at the University of Bosphorus and Nantes University. Thank you, Huri. I'm going to move on and ask the last two questions to Ambassador Suri. One question is actually on the issue of the diaspora. Looking at the recent changes, what impact will have this on the laborers working in West Asia and on the promotion of human rights and liberal values? That's one question. And secondly, what do you think is the future of this connectivity project, International North-South Transport Corridor?
Okay.
Which has involved Qatar. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you know, let me take the second one first. I've already tried to mention that the Chabahar project and the North-South Corridor project is important not just for India but for the countries in the region, and to create an alternate route for several of them. We remain committed to it, but we appreciate that there have been headwinds. We are watching the developments with regard to some of the proposals that the Chinese have made to Iran, etc. But as of now, we remain fully committed, and we've allocated substantial resources for the project. On the diaspora, you know, we've got close to 9 million, 8 million, depending on which estimate you take, Indians in the Gulf. It's a different diaspora from that in US, Canada, Australia, UK, etc. In the sense that something like 70% of the community is blue collar. But because it's blue collar, it comes with a lot of challenges. Many of the countries in the Gulf have regulations that leave something to be desired in terms of the protections that they offer to labor in particular. And it remains a constant endeavor, a constant battle for our embassies in the region to do whatever we can in terms of using our good offices with the governments and the labor courts and so on, to make sure that our people in the Gulf get a reasonable and fair deal. I should say that if you look at a trend, then over the last 5 or 6 years, things have improved. Qatar, for example, because it's hosting the FIFA World Cup, recognized that unless it improves its labor laws, it will risk substantial reputational damage. And that is, as these countries try to build their own brand equity around the world, they realize that treatment of labor is crucial to the image that they seek to portray around the world. So for their own sake, they have made changes in their labor legislation. And from our point of view, the 2 or 3 specific issues with regard to labor that we have been working on. One is to see whether we can make sure that everybody who goes in an unskilled category goes through our e-migrate portal. So that they go through empaneled regular manpower agents, and there are protections available, the contracts are filed in the system, and so on. The second, which we have made a lot of progress with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, is to see whether our e-migrate portal can be connected with the labor portals of those countries, so that the same contract and the same system is available across the board, and we can get better protections for our workers in case an employer tries to substitute the original contract for an inferior contract, which is a common practice in these places. And the third is to see whether we can upskill our people and make sure.
Sorry, we cannot. Ambassador Suri, are you there? I think we have lost him. His connection is okay. Professor Inbal, just 30 seconds. Any closing comment on the entire discussion?
Well, first of all, about Turkey. Turkey is part of the West Asia. It decided to be part of West Asia against its Kemalist traditions that wanted to distance Turkey from the Arab world and the Muslim world. And this decision is reinforced by Islamist and neo-Ottomanist tones in the current ruling elite of Turkey. Turkey is a strong country with an army that is ready to fight, not like some of the NATO members that are ready to sing and march, but not really to do any fighting. So this is a very important country. It could maybe be some kind of balance for Iran. I'm not sure it will do so. The relation between those countries have been historically very cautious. They've refrained from going to war with each other. And of course, there is, I must admit, there is some kind of pragmatist streak in Erdogan. For example, he has good economic relations with Israel because his people are making money and it's important for his base of support. But in other areas, the behavior of Turkey is extremely destructive. For example, its connections to Hamas in Gaza, what he's trying to undermine Israeli authority in Jerusalem, in parallel to his competition with Saudi Arabia on the leadership in the Muslim world. So Turkey is something to watch, and I'm not sure that our discussion gave enough attention to this issue.
Right. Thank you, Professor Inbal. Ambassador Suri, actually we lost you when you were speaking about the third point, but do you want to give some closing comments before I hand over the floor to Ambassador Bhatia? You're on mute.
I recognize that we are running against the clock, so I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Inbal and Ambassador Suri. Ambassador Bhatia, I call upon Ambassador Bhatia, Distinguished Fellow for Foreign Policy Studies, to give his closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samir. What a thought-provoking and stimulating dialogue we have just had in the past 1 hour and a few more minutes. This was really not for 101 types. This was for advanced students. This was not a helicopter view of West Asia. It was a microscopic view that gave to us very clear idea of the complexities and the fault lines of a very, very difficult and yet a very challenging region by any stretch of imagination. I think in the past 75 minutes, we have really covered a very broad range of issues dealing with Israel, Gulf, Egypt, the Turkish perspective, Palestinian issue, US policy, the Iran question very much, and on top of that, even India, Gulf and India-West Asia relations. I know that many questions could not be taken up because of the, despite the brave attempts of Samir, our moderator, but I know that there are quite a few journalists are sitting in the audience, and I think they would have certainly noted that this session will be known for quite some time for its very catching one-liners. I could manage to catch a few, and I'm going to very quickly read them. One, Biden will not be Obama too. Two, Abraham Accords have bestowed legitimacy on Israel, which is now seen as a native entity, a native actor. Three, UAE is a very interesting country which punches above its weight and which has many other characteristics about it. Next, political Islam is the first step on the ladder, on the slippery ladder to various kinds of negative tendencies that were mentioned by Navdeep. Next, we do not see too many democracies around in this region. Another one really caught the eye. ICC is a fly. It does not matter. And then one more, I think this was from Navdeep, the Gulf is no longer the playground of terrorists patronized by Pakistan. And I was also struck by Professor Inbar when he pointedly asked, how many of you have actually participated in any military action? I think this was an extraordinary dialogue where panelists brought to bear on this discussion their decades of experience, reflection, and wisdom. We are truly grateful to them. We know that in such a short time, we cannot possibly cover all other angles. There were many other things that we would have liked to hear. And I'm sure it is for that reason Gateway House might plan yet another session very soon on this very, very important and relevant theme. I take this opportunity on behalf of both CAS and Gateway House to convey our very deep appreciation to the panelists, to the moderator, to our wonderful audience, and we hope that we will see you again on similar, very, very interesting series of dialogues that we keep holding from time to time. Over to you, Samir.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Bhatia. In fact, I should add that we were honored to also host former Lebanese Prime Minister Fawad Siniora amongst the audience, who keenly watched the entire discussion. So thank you so much, the entire Gateway House team and guests and the audience for joining us this evening. We'll see you again next month for another episode of Gateway House CAS webcast. Thank you. Have a nice evening ahead.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Professor Inbar. Thank you, Navdeep. Thank you, Rimel. Pankaj, nice to see you.
Thank you.